It was a cold morning on the outskirts of the city, where the skeletal framework of a new construction site towered like an unfinished monument to progress. The site was a place of hustle and hard labor, with cranes groaning under the weight of new materials, bulldozers pushing through the dirt, and workers in their faded orange vests moving like ants. But amidst the concrete and machinery, there was something far more dangerous and unexpected: a python. The python, large and menacing, had made its way into the construction site, finding refuge among the piles of steel beams and abandoned tools. Its cold eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the site as though it knew exactly where to hide. For the past few days, workers had whispered about strange noises coming from the shadows, but no one had thought much of it. That was until the first of the site's cats was found lifeless in the dirt, its fur matted and torn. The cats, strays that had wandered onto the site years ago, had become a quiet part of the workers' routine. They were scavengers, of course, but they were loved by the crew nonetheless. Some workers had even named them, feeding them scraps and offering a moment of comfort on a long, grueling shift. But now, with the python lurking in the shadows, they were in danger. The cat's disappearance wasn't just an eerie mystery. It was a threat to the entire site's atmosphere. A dozen workers had gathered around the remains of the first cat to fall victim to the snake, staring at the gruesome scene in horror. "That's not any regular snake," one worker, Jake, said in a hushed tone, his voice trembling. "It's got to be a python." The crew laughed nervously, dismissing the threat as just another thing to be dealt with. "Snakes are around here all the time. It's probably just a rat snake," another worker, Danny, said. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Pythons were different. Jake, who had lived in the area for years, was convinced that the snake had somehow slithered into the construction site from the nearby forest that bordered the town. The heavy rains in the past weeks had driven many animals out of their natural habitats, and the python was likely following prey. And as it turned out, the cats were easy targets. Jake had always been more cautious than most of the crew, sensing danger where others did not. But even he couldn't have anticipated what was about to happen. Days passed, and more cats went missing. The workers started to notice the signs of the python's presence: shredded fur in hidden corners, puncture wounds on the ground, and a pervasive unease hanging over the site. The python was clearly hunting them. It seemed to be everywhere, hiding in plain sight. And yet, it wasn't the snake that was the biggest threat. No, the real danger was far more insidious, and it wasn't until that one fateful afternoon that the workers would realize how much worse things could get. It started when one of the cats, a particularly scrappy little tabby named Patch, was spotted darting across the site, eyes wide with terror. It was running from something far more dangerous than any snake. It was as if the very earth had begun to tremble beneath their feet. The workers looked on in confusion as Patch disappeared into a steel crate, her tiny body trembling, eyes wide in fear. Jake approached the crate cautiously, his mind racing. The python wasn't the only threat. Something else was stirring beneath the surface, something that had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for far too long. As Jake bent down to inspect the crate, he could feel it, something unnatural, a presence that was heavy, suffocating. The air felt thick with fear, and for the first time, Jake wasn't just worried about the safety of the cats. He was worried for the safety of everyone on the site. It wasn't just a python anymore. The workers had no idea what they were about to face. The real danger was just beginning to reveal itself, and none of them could have prepared for what would unfold next. The tension built as the camera zoomed in on Jake's face, his eyes wide with realization. Something was lurking just beyond their understanding, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The workers on the construction site were a tight-knit group, each of them with their own stories, their own lives, and their own reasons for being there. It was a hard, thankless job, one that required grit and perseverance. But over the years, a sense of camaraderie had formed between them, and despite the tough conditions, they had become a family of sorts. Jake, the one who had always been the most cautious, was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had grown up in the small town that had sprawled into the outskirts, knowing every dirt path and every shadow in the woods. His father had been a construction worker, too, and Jake had followed in his footsteps, taking pride in building something from nothing, even if it meant sacrificing the comforts of life for the hard labor. Then there was Danny, the jokester, the one who always tried to lighten the mood. Danny was in his mid-30s, with a contagious laugh that could disarm even the most tense moments. He loved the thrill of working in construction, pushing boundaries, taking risks. But as much as Danny acted tough, there was a soft spot inside him, a deep care for the people he worked with. He didn't want to admit it, but he had become attached to the cats that had roamed the site. They were part of the family, too. And then, of course, there was Marcus, the foreman. Marcus had been with the company the longest. He was in his 50s, and he had seen everything. He was a stoic man, built like a mountain, with a voice that carried authority. But what Marcus didn't show was the internal battle that raged inside him. He had a family. His wife and 2 kids were waiting for him at home every night, but he had grown distant over the years. His job was his life, and his life was construction. The workers respected him, but they knew there was a weight on his shoulders. And now, with the python and the mysterious danger that seemed to be following it, that weight was becoming too much to bear. Then there was Sarah, the young woman who had just started working on the site a few months ago. She was still getting used to the fast-paced, rough environment of construction, but she had proven herself to be capable and strong. She was a fighter, never backing down, always willing to lend a hand. She had quickly bonded with the other workers, particularly Jake, who had taken a protective interest in her. They had become close, and in the midst of all the chaos surrounding the python, she found herself becoming more and more involved in the mystery that was unfolding. For each of them, the construction site had always been just another part of life. But now, with the deadly python lurking in the shadows and an ominous feeling filling the air, they were realizing that this job wasn't just about building. It was about survival. The tension in the air was thick, and every worker felt it, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. Jake, however, knew that something wasn't right. He had seen the signs, small things that others missed. There were no more sounds of the cats meowing in the distance. They had disappeared. The remaining cats had become skittish, vanishing as soon as a worker came near. And it wasn't just the animals. The ground itself felt wrong, almost as if something was stirring underneath it. Danny tried to lighten the mood as usual, but even he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over the site. Maybe the snake's gone off to find a new neighborhood, he joked, but his voice lacked its usual humor. Everyone knew it wasn't just a snake. It was something deeper, something far worse. And Danny, despite his bravado, was feeling it too. Marcus had always been the calm one, but even he was showing signs of unease. His usual routine of managing the site was disrupted, his mind wandering back to his family, to his kids, to the worries that plagued him. He had always believed that he could keep everyone safe, but now he was questioning everything. Could he protect them from whatever was lurking on the site? Sarah was different. She hadn't been on the site long enough to understand the deeper undercurrents that ran through the place. But as she worked alongside Jake, she began to see the tension in the air, feel the weight of fear pressing down on everyone. There was no mistaking it. This was no ordinary threat. It was something they hadn't encountered before, something that was larger than all of them. She found herself walking alongside Jake one afternoon, the sound of the construction site quiet around them. "Jake, what do you think is really going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the area before answering. "I don't know, Sarah, but I think we're about to find out." Their conversation was interrupted when Marcus called for a meeting. The workers gathered in a huddle, their eyes darting between each other. Marcus looked at them, his usual stern demeanor replaced by an unsettling seriousness. "Listen up," he began. "We've got a problem. It's not just a python. There's something else going on here, something I can't explain. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was coming, it was going to be far worse than any of them had imagined. The days dragged on, but the sense of unease on the construction site only intensified. The python was still out there, slithering in the shadows, its presence more than just a threat to the cats. It was now a symbol of something far darker. The workers could feel it in their bones. Every creak of the steel beams, every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig set their nerves on edge. There was something beneath the surface that none of them could understand, something sinister that was drawing closer. Jake was no longer concerned with just a snake. His instincts told him there was something worse lurking, something that the python was merely a symptom of. He spent hours on the site, searching for any clues, any signs of what could be causing this overwhelming feeling of dread. He noticed that the workers seemed more agitated than usual. Conversations had grown quiet. The once lively chatter during breaks had turned into hushed whispers. The workers avoided certain parts of the site, sticking to familiar areas, afraid to venture into the corners where the python had been seen. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the site, Jake found something. It wasn't just a dead cat, as he had feared, but something far more unsettling. It was a large, twisted mass of fur and bones, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as if whatever had attacked it had done so with malicious intent, tearing through the animal's body with ruthless precision. His heart raced as he backed away, fear rising in his chest. The python might have been dangerous, but this was something far worse. Jake rushed to find Marcus, his footsteps echoing through the emptying site. When he found Marcus in the foreman's office, he barely took the time to knock before he burst through the door. "Marcus, you need to see this," Jake said, his voice tight with panic. "It's not just a snake. There's something else out there. Something worse." Marcus looked up from the papers he was reviewing, his face grim. "I knew it. What did you find?" Jake didn't wait for the question to be repeated. "It's the cats, Marcus. It's not just a python killing them. There's something else in the woods. Something we've been overlooking." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Whatever it is, it's not a snake. Not anymore." Marcus stood up, his face hardening. "Show me." They walked together to the edge of the site, where Jake had found the gruesome remains. The air was thick with tension, and as they approached the area, they both felt it, the oppressive weight of something watching them. They stopped a few feet from the carcass, and Marcus crouched down to inspect it. His jaw tightened, and Jake could see the recognition in his eyes. This isn't a predator. It's a warning. Jake's stomach twisted as he processed Marcus's words. Whatever was out there wasn't just hunting for food. It was hunting for something more, something they couldn't yet understand. The feeling of unease grew stronger, like the very ground beneath them was trembling, waiting for something to break. "Is this a wild animal, or something else?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands. "I'm not sure, but I've been around long enough to know when something's off. This isn't a typical animal attack. It's deliberate." He turned to Jake, his eyes dark with concern. "You need to keep your eyes open. There's something happening here, and we're not prepared for it." Jake nodded, but deep inside, he felt a growing sense of dread. He had been right all along. The snake was just a beginning. Something darker, more malevolent, was moving through the woods, and they were all in its path. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. The workers no longer felt safe on the site. Even the machines seemed to groan in discomfort, as if they, too, were aware of the growing danger. The atmosphere became thick with fear. No one wanted to be the next victim of whatever was stalking the cats, and soon they stopped going near the woods altogether. The construction site, once a place of relentless activity, had become a ghost town at times, with only a few workers brave enough to stay behind and continue their tasks. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sense of being surrounded grew stronger with each passing day. The workers began carrying tools for self-defense, and the sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the site as they searched for anything that could provide them protection. One evening, as the workers gathered around a makeshift campfire just outside the site, Sarah approached Jake, her face pale and worried. "Jake, what do you think is really going on? I keep hearing strange noises at night, like footsteps in the woods. And sometimes, I swear I hear whispers." Jake looked at her, his expression serious. "I've been hearing them too. It's like something's calling to us from the forest. Something we can't see, but it's there." Just then, a scream pierced the air, breaking the uneasy silence. The workers leaped to their feet, eyes wide with panic. Without thinking, Jake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the source of the scream. The workers followed, fear spreading like wildfire through the group. They reached the edge of the construction site, where one of the workers, Tony, was standing frozen in place. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the woods. The rest of the crew followed his gaze, their breath catching in their throats as they saw what he was pointing at. There, in the dimming light, stood something that none of them could explain. A pair of glowing eyes, watching them from the shadows. The glowing eyes in the shadows weren't a trick of the light. As Jake's heart pounded in his chest, he could feel the presence of whatever was out there, watching them, waiting. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation, but the fear in the air made it almost impossible to think straight. The workers stood frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. Tony, still pointing, his voice a quiver of panic, whispered, "What is that? It's not an animal. It's something else. It's looking at us." Jake stepped forward, instinct kicking in, despite every fiber of his body telling him to run. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the ground as he crept closer to the trees, his eyes fixed on the pair of eyes that glowed eerily in the darkness. The air felt thick with tension, as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Jake, wait!" Sarah called, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. As he drew closer, the air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping sharply. It was like stepping into another world, where the normal rules didn't apply. The trees loomed tall and ominous, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, as if they, too, were afraid of what was lurking within their depths. But Jake's focus never wavered. Those eyes, they were all he could see. There was something in them, something that was both animal and something far more intelligent. Suddenly, the eyes blinked, and the creature, whatever it was, moved, emerging from the shadows. It was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. It wasn't just an animal. It was something otherworldly. Its body was massive, covered in fur, and yet it had a strange, almost mechanical quality to it, like it had been forged from something more than just flesh. The glowing eyes were set deep into its face, piercing through the darkness as if it could see into the deepest corners of their souls. Jake's breath hitched, his body tense with a primal fear he had never experienced before. He instinctively took a step back, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, towering over them, waiting. The workers behind him were paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch. The calm, steady demeanor that Marcus usually displayed had completely dissolved. His jaw was clenched tight, and his hand hovered near the gun at his side, but he made no move to pull it out. This isn't possible," Marcus muttered, his voice low. "What is that thing?" Jake shook his head, unable to speak. He was too transfixed by the creature, too terrified to form a coherent thought. But Sarah, the youngest and most determined among them, stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos that seemed to be enveloping the sight. "Jake, what do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. "We have to do something." Jake turned toward her, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know. We're not ready for this." The creature let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground, shaking the workers to their core. It wasn't a normal growl. There was an unnatural quality to it, something that sent chills crawling up their spines. Suddenly, the creature lunged. Time seemed to slow as it charged forward, its eyes glowing brighter, its massive body moving faster than anything should be able to. The workers scattered, shouting in terror as the creature tore through the air, its claws swiping at anything in its path. It was like a nightmare brought to life. There was no reasoning with it, no chance of escape. Jake dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's sharp claws as they slashed through the air, missing him by inches. The sound of metal tearing and wood splintering filled the air as the creature slammed into a steel beam, knocking it loose from its foundation. The workers, panicking, scrambled for cover, running in every direction as the creature wreaked havoc. "Marcus!" Jake shouted, grabbing the foreman's arm as he ducked behind a nearby crate. "We need to get control of this. We can't just run. We have to fight back." Marcus's face was pale, his usual composure completely gone. "How do we fight something like that? It's not just an animal. It's something else. We don't know how to stop it." Jake's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. He looked around, eyes darting between the wreckage, his thoughts pulling together fragments of the construction site's resources. "We have tools. We have machines. We have to fight back, no matter what." He glanced at Danny, who was clutching a crowbar, his hands shaking. "Danny, get the others together. We need to fight back." Danny nodded, though the fear in his eyes was palpable. He shouted orders to the other workers, rallying them as they scrambled to pick up anything that could be used as a weapon. It wasn't ideal. These were construction tools, not weapons, but it was all they had. The creature let out another deafening roar, shaking the ground beneath them. But this time, the workers were ready. They had their tools, their courage, and each other, as a unit. They began to circle the creature, trying to stay out of its reach, but it was too fast, too unpredictable. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. There was no turning back now. He had to protect the workers, protect Sarah, protect everyone. This thing, whatever it was, had to be stopped. With one final, deafening roar, the creature lunged at Jake, its claws extended. But at the last moment, Jake sidestepped, grabbing a heavy wrench from the ground. He swung it with all his might, connecting with the creature's skull. The impact echoed like a gunshot, and for a brief moment, the creature staggered back. That was enough. The workers rallied, working together to subdue the creature, using every tool they could get their hands on. It was chaos, pure, unrelenting chaos. But in the end, the creature fell, its massive body crumpling to the ground with a final, shuddering breath. The glow in its eyes faded, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. Breathing heavily, Jake looked around at the scene of destruction. The workers, though exhausted, were alive. They had survived the impossible. But the real victory wasn't in the battle itself. It was in the bond they had formed in the face of unimaginable fear. They had stood together, and together they had triumphed. The silence that followed was deafening. The battle was over, but the weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air. The workers, battered and bruised, stood around the creature's fallen body, their faces pale, their expressions a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. Their hearts still raced in their chests, and the adrenaline that had kept them alive through the chaos began to ebb away, leaving only the raw aftermath of what they had survived. Jake looked around, his breath still shaky. He had fought alongside the others, but he couldn't help but feel a deep, unsettling sense of loss. The creature, though vanquished, had left its mark on all of them. The terror they had experienced, the things they had witnessed, none of them would ever be the same again. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you are never fully prepared for the things that lurk in the shadows. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice low and tired. "We did it," he said, though there was no joy in his tone. "But at what cost? Sarah, who had been standing beside Jake, let out a soft, relieved breath. She had been quiet for most of the aftermath, but she couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them away, trying to maintain her composure. She had been the youngest on the site, the one who had just started to build her life here. Now, as she looked at the damage and destruction around them, it felt like everything she had worked for was suddenly so fragile. She reached out to Jake, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "We made it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But what happens now?" Jake turned to face her, his eyes darkened with the weight of everything that had happened. "We rebuild," he said softly. "We move forward, but we'll never forget what we've been through." The other workers gathered around them, their faces showing the same exhaustion, the same sense of relief mixed with disbelief. It wasn't just the physical toll of the battle that had left its mark. It was the emotional scars, the lingering feeling of being caught between survival and loss. "Are the cats gone for good?" Danny asked, breaking the silence, his voice a little more somber than usual. "All those lives." Jake nodded, his heart heavy. "I don't know, but we couldn't save them. Not all of them. We'll have to learn to live with that. The loss of the cats, the creatures that had once roamed the site so freely, was another silent casualty of this strange, harrowing battle. They had been part of the landscape, constant, comforting, a reminder of life continuing amidst the chaos of construction. But now, with their absence, the site felt even more desolate, as if the very heart of the place had been taken from them. Sarah, sensing Jake's deep sorrow, gently took his hand. "We're alive. That's what matters. We're still here." Her words were simple, but they cut through the heaviness of the moment. She was right. They had faced something none of them could have predicted, and yet here they were. They were alive. The workers slowly began to disperse, each of them finding their own quiet space to process the night's events. Some sat down on nearby crates, staring out at the wreckage, while others cleaned the tools they had used to fight back. No one spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had survived, and that, in itself, was something extraordinary. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature was gone, yes, but the terror it had brought with it was still fresh in his mind. What had driven it to the construction site? What had awakened it from wherever it had been hiding? He turned to Marcus, who had been standing off to the side, looking out at the dark horizon. "Do you think it's really over?" Jake asked, his voice low. Marcus glanced at him, his face troubled. "I don't know, Jake, but I think we've just scratched the surface of whatever's out there. This isn't the last time we'll see something like this. Not in a place like this." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. The forest, the site, the animals, it was all connected. There was something ancient and untold about the land they had built on, something that had awoken when they disturbed it. Whatever forces had brought the creature to their doorstep were far from finished. But for now, Jake focused on the present. The workers were safe. They had fought together, and they had won. And that, at least for tonight, was enough. As the night wore on and the construction site grew quiet once more, the workers gathered in the break area, each of them in their own thoughts. The world outside continued, but here, within the walls of the site, they shared a moment of peace, a fleeting, fragile peace in the wake of something terrifying. Sarah sat beside Jake, her head resting against his shoulder. They didn't need to speak. The weight of everything they had survived hung in the air between them, but for the first time in days, there was a sense of calm. They had faced the darkness together, and together they had made it through. The emotional toll of that night would linger, but there was something unspoken in the way they looked at each other, the way they held onto one another. They had survived, and in that, they had found something stronger than fear. They had found each other. As the workers gathered together, exhausted but relieved, they knew that their bond would forever be marked by the terrifying ordeal they had endured. Despite the fear, they had come together, stood strong, and fought back against a danger no one could have imagined. In the end, they survived, not just because of their strength, but because they had each other. If this story has inspired you, if you've ever felt the need to rise above fear and uncertainty, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if you believe that, no matter the odds, we can overcome anything when we work together. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of resilience, courage, and the strength that lies in unity. Together, we can face anything life throws our way.